So a ternary expression, you want to assign to a variable, you want to assign it something based on the result of another. For this, I'm going to take our max num that we did in the lab yesterday. Say system.out.println max num, and then I'll give it a couple arguments. So that should print 100, and if I make this negative, that should now print 2. There's a few different ways to do the max num function. I'm going to write one of them out. Public static int max num takes an int num1, and it takes an int num2. There's a way to do this with only one return. Create a result variable. If num1 is less than num2, result equals num2, else result equals num1, and at the bottom, return result. Run this, and I see 102 on the right. So I create a result variable. If number 1 is the smaller one, assign num2 to result. Otherwise, I assign num1 to result. This is like the exact situation a ternary expression is meant for. It's meant for when you have a variable that you're creating but not setting to anything, and then you're taking two different branches, and depending on the value of some condition, you're setting it to something else. The syntax for this is you have a condition, then a question mark, and then your true case, and then a colon, and then your false case. Instead of having this whole block of code, I'll comment that out, and I say int result equals, and we're gonna have the same condition we had before. Num1 is less than num2, question mark, the true case, num2, false case, num1. And then I can see the same return result down here. The way this works is it looks at the condition all the way up to the question mark. If that condition is true, the result of this entire expression is the first thing here. If the condition is false, then the result of the expression is the second thing here. So you can read this as the question mark is like, is num1 less than num2? Oh, it is? Okay, then this is the result. It's not? All right, then that's the result. So if this is true, then this thing, otherwise that thing. This is different than an if else. We're not expressing this as what branch of code we want to execute. We're just saying what we want our results to be. This is more of a functional approach to things as opposed to like the imperative or procedural approaches that we've seen. Instead of do this, do this, do this, do this, do this, you just kind of define what it is you're looking for. What's the larger number? Well, if num1 is less than num2, then the larger number is num2. Otherwise, it's num1. You can get things done without ternaries, but as you can see, it can abbreviate things quite a bit. I can even make this shorter because the result variable here is kind of extra. We don't really need this. I can just return the result of the ternary itself, do the ternary, and then whatever that is, return that. So now our maxnum function is just one line. So instead of saying what we do, the results of the condition, so if this, then return num1, we say if this, then the whole thing is equal to num1 or whatever. The question mark is what makes this a ternary. It separates the condition from the true case and the false case. This the syntax this thing follows. Unlike an if, there's no way to have this without an else. Kind of, you always need a true and a false because you have to assign something. This expression has to evaluate to something. At this point, I can just delete everything else I have here. I can leave this comment in, but now we have maxnum. It's only got one line in it, and that's great. This doesn't necessarily need to be just variables either. I could do something like weird here, like I could say num2 plus 5, and that's illegal. It doesn't make sense in the context of this maxnum function, but I could do that. I can call another function here and return the result of another function's call. Lots of different things. It's just something needs to go here for true and then here for false. All right, so I also want to address some things that I saw people doing in the labs over the last couple of days. Let's just say I do return num2 here, return num1. I've seen a lot of people making the same mistake where they put a condition on their else. If num1 is less than num2, else num1 is greater than or equal to num2. Not only would this be redundant to have as an else if, but you can't just have an else with a condition. An else just means when the first one is false. There is no other condition on an else. If you want another condition, there needs to be an if. So the conditions are attached to ifs. They're not attached to the elses. If I run this, I'm just going to get an error, not a statement on this condition right here. If I were to make this syntactically correct by putting an else if here, I'm going to get an even more confusing error telling me that I'm missing a return statement. The basic way to understand this is that Java thinks you can get to the end of the function without returning anything. It doesn't realize that these two conditions cover every case. It's not smart enough to do that kind of analysis. It makes more sense if I wrote this. It would say missing return because if num1 and num2 are equal, I haven't handled that. Obviously, we can look at this and say every case that could possibly exist is handled by one of these two. Java can't do that. The compiler isn't smart enough to do that. So we just have to have an else instead. So else's don't have conditions. And if you don't have to repeat your conditions, don't repeat your conditions. Also on the homeworks I've started to see, instead of if and else, I've seen people doing an if check for one thing and then if check on the opposite. You don't want to do that. Just have an if for the true case and then do an else to handle the false case. If you put an else on this, eventually Java will see no matter what, there has to be a way to return something. But if you don't return something from a function that says I return an int, that's an error. Because if you can get to the bottom of the function without returning, then the thing that's trying to see your result is would have some indeterminate value, but Java won't let you get away with that, which is good. And there's also this thing with redundant checks, the number to letter grade one. If I did char number to letter grade, and then I have my int grade, I've seen quite a bit of this kind of thing where you have your first if, which is fine. If grade is greater than or equal to 90, return the character A. But on else ifs, people are writing else if the grade is greater than or equal to 80, which is right. Then they're also saying and the grade is less than 90 or it's less than or equal to 89. Return B, and then doing it for all the other grades. But you don't need this and here. So let's say I call this with 91. It's going to check if grade is greater than or equal to 90. That's going to be true. So it's going to go to line 4. It's going to return A. And then we don't look at anything here because all the else's are connected. Remember when we have else if, you look at them one at a time And as soon as you find one that's true, you execute the body for that one, and that's, you don't look at any of the other else ifs. So this would just be that. So you don't need to have and. It's a redundant check because the earlier one already checked if it was greater than or equal to 90. So you know that that was false. So that means it must be less than 90. These checks are redundant. You don't want to repeat checks that you don't have to. There was one other thing I wanted to get at with the maxnum function. Let's say I put that return result down here, but instead of creating results at the top, I said int results equals num2 here. Then I did the same thing on this line. This is going to fail now because I'm going to get cannot find symbol on the result variable. That error is on line 8, we can see in our output, because it's trying to return results here. But every time we have braces, the things inside of those braces are only visible from there and to other things nested inside of it. Meaning this result here is local to the if, and this result here is local to the else, and you can't see it outside of those blocks. These two results, not only are they two different variables from each other, but they're just invisible on line 8. Every time you have a variable inside of braces, it's not going to be visible before that open brace, and it's not going to be visible after the closed brace. It just goes away. You have to create the result outside of the braces and then just assign to it inside of them. Since I created up here, now it's visible inside of these, so you can go down and still see it. All right, so I've got a whole bunch of code up here right now with a whole bunch of functions. These functions all call each other and they all do weird things. What we're going to do is we're going to step through this and we're going to figure out what calls what and when. Where do we start running our code? What's the first line of code we run? Where do we always start running after main? So what's the first line? Line 20, right. It goes to line 6, and what is num going to be now? So we called func1 from line 20, which brought us from line 20 to line 6, passing 5 for the num parameter. So now we have num as 5. What happens then? On line 7, we're going to print 5. We are going to print out a 5. Then what do we do? So we have num plus equals 3. So now num is equal to 8 because we've raised it by 3. So line 9, what happens there? It'll print out 8 because we passed in a 5 here. So on line 6, we have num is equal to 5. That's this 5 here. And then we do plus equals 3. So just add 3 to that. Store the result back in num. So now num is equal to 8. What do we do next? That's the end of our program. We're done with this function. So we exit here, we come down here, and we're finished. Why do I have func2 on here? Func2 never runs because I never called it. So let's change this. Instead of calling func1, let's call func2. Start at main, line 19, and then where do we go? Line 12, and what's num going to be? So we're going to go to line 13, and where does that take us? What function are we calling on line 13? Line 6. So we go to line 6, and what's num going to be? It's going to be 5 because we passed a 5 from here into here, so num is 5, and then we're just passing that same number along to func1, and its num is going to be 5. Line 7. What are we printing on line 7? So we print 5, and then line 8, right? So we add 3 to num. On line 9, then we're going to print 8. Where do we go from there? Not yet. Where did we call func1? How did we get here? So what's the next one we run after we're done with line 9? Right. What happens on line 14? It will print 5. But didn't we say num plus equals 3 in func1? We called func1, which passed the 5 up here, and we did num plus equals 3 here, which printed out 8. So you might think this is going to print out 8 now because we changed num in the other function. But when you pass an int like that to another function, it creates a copy of it. It's adding 3 to the copy. We're not adding 3 to the original one. So down here, when we print it out, it's going to print out 5 again. We're on 15 now. We'll go up to line 2. We'll have I equals what? I equals 5. It's not going to print out anything because times 2 doesn't print anything. So times 2 takes I. We have I equals 5. What happens next? What's I? So 5 times 2. What do we get on line 15? What's the last thing we do? That is a good point. In math, if you just have like x, y, this means x times y, or it can mean a function call. But in CS, this means a function call, not multiplication. So we're calling times 2 with 5. We pass that 5 to times 2. It multiplies it by 2, and it returns the result. What happens next? We just stored 10 into num2. And what do we do? What's the next line after line 15? Printing what? 10. 5, 8, 5, 10. The 10 came from... It's num2 here. On line 15, we have times 2 of num. Num here is 5. We pass it up here, so we have I equals 5 now. We multiply it by 2, so we get 10. Then we return that result, which goes into the num2 variable right here. So this one's a little bit longer. What's the first function we always start at? We're starting on line 25 because its name is main. Always look for a main as the first place to start. What happens on 27? What function are we calling? Func2? And where is that? Line 12, correct. And what are we giving to func2? What is num going to be? So we're giving it var. What is var down here? So what's num going to be? So we call func2 and we pass it var, which is 5. So it gets that 5. What do we do next? If num is less than 10, is that true or false? It's true because num is 5. So 5 is less than 10 is true. Then what? So we jump up to line 6, and what's num going to be? It's 5. We pass var into func2 here, so we have a 5 here. We checked it against 10. It's less than 10. That's true. So we enter the first case of our if. We say func1 with num, same 5. So we pass 5 along. So now we're on line 6. We're inside of func1, and we have a 5. What do we do next? 7, which does what? Prints 5. Go to 8 plus equals 3. It adds 3. So what's 9 going to print out? 9 is going to print out 8. Actually, add one more line of code here at the bottom. So we printed out 8 right here. Where do we go now? 15. And and that's going to print what? 5. We ran line 15. What's the next line of code we run? We called func1 here, came in, we ran all this code, and then when we were done with this, we jumped down to the next line right after that call. We printed out 5 because it's still 5 even though we changed it here. Num in here is a copy. So what's the next line of code we run after 15? Remember that with else ifs, we only go until we find a true case. You run the code, the first true case you find, and then you skip the rest of them. So we're not going to look at anything else. We're not going to run the else case though either because this was already true. So once this is true, once we find an if or an else if that's true, we run that one and then we skip the rest. Just like if you have if else, you only run one or the other. If you have if else, you're only going to run one of the 3, whichever one is true. Either one of the ifs is true or you run the else case in the end. But since this one was true, we're not going to run the else if block, we're not going to run the else block. We're going to skip over both of those. So where does that take us? Line 23, which prints out num, which is what? 5. So we print out another 5 here. So now we got 5, 8, 5, 5. Where do we go after line 23? So it prints out 5. Then we say what? On line 30, what is this doing? So now var is 15 and then line 31. So we call func2 again, which takes us to what line? So we jump to line 12 and what's num going to be? It'll be 15. So we're func going with 15. Good. So we're going to say if num is less than 10 here, it's 15 now. So that's false. So then we jump down to line 16. If num is less than 20, which is, so num is less than 15 is true now. So we went to line 17. What function are we calling? And what are we giving it for the I argument? It's going to return 30 from here, and that's going to be stored in num2. Then what? We had num is 15. We came into our else if 15 is less than 20 is true. Then we called times 2, which passes a 15 up to this function on line 2. So now we have I is 15. Then what happens? We get 30. It's going to return 30. 30 goes to num2, and then we're going to print 30 here. Since we're done with the else if was true, we're going to skip the else case. So what's the next line after the else case? 23. Since this was true, we don't look at any other cases, skip over the else case, and we come to line 23. And then we print out what? 15. What's the next line of code we're running here? 32. We're done with this call with var here, and then we're going to say func2 var times 2. What function are we calling? So we jump to line 12, and what's num going to be? Not 15, not the column 31, the column 32. So it says var times 2. 30. So we're on line 12, we have num is equal to 30. What's the next line we look at? If num is less than 10, is that true or false? What do we look at after that? Is that true or false? It's false. And then we just run that because all of our if checks failed, so now we're in the else case. So it'll be 25. Now what do we print out on line 21? 25. So we print out a 25. 23 is going to print what? It's going to print 25 again. And now what do? We're done. That's right. So we're done with func2. So we come back to the main and we've hit the bottom of main and our program is done. Our expected output is 5, 8, 5, 5, 5, 30, 15, 25, 25. Let's see if we got it. 5, 8, 5, 5, 5, 30, 15, 25, 25. We did it. We can see that we have these functions now calling each other if else's. So you can have the conditions of an if inside of a function that can choose whether or not you call another function. Just following the path, figuring out what lines call to what other lines. But this is the whole program. One important note to have here is that this num right here and this num here, even though they have the same name, since they're in different scopes, they are distinct variables. They are just as different as the I here is from the num here, and just as distinct as the num here is from the var here. You say that my function takes an argument, and then the caller decides what it will be for its run of the function.
Exactly.
So every time you call it, it can be different. Similar to how every time you run your program and use a scanner, you can type a different number in every time. I would like to talk about a couple things, mostly related to the homework. How to take a problem, break it down, like how to take a vague problem description and turn it into code. I feel pretty confident at this point if I ask you guys, write a program that takes a number from a scanner, multiplies it by 3 and prints the result, that you could do that. Or say multiply by 8 and prints the result. You could do that. But if I say something like, I'm going to tell you the number of pizzas, you tell me the total number of slices, it's the same problem. Take it and multiply it by 8. That step of saying, take the tools that I have, and how do I use code to solve this problem? That's the step I'm trying to get you guys to understand. For this, I want to run through the bagel shop homework assignment. If you look at what we have in our output here, like what our eventual goal is, we know that we need 3 things. So we're trying to solve for 3 things in our homework. What was the first one? The number of dozens. Well, we want to find how many dozens. I know that's going to be an int, and I know num dozens. So that's one of the things I want to get to. What's another thing I need? The number of individual bagels. So I'm going to call that number of extras. And what's the last thing that I need to print out? Total. So that's going to be a double. Total cost. Now what's the one thing we know we get as input? The number of bagels. So I can write these variables in my code. Int num bagels, int num dozens, we'll get there, int num extras, and double total cost. I know at some point you need to calculate both of these. I'm going to work this problem backwards. So the total cost. Assuming that I could figure out what num extras and num dozens is, how do I get the total cost based on that? I know that a dozen costs $8.50. I know that an individual costs 1. So what's the formula I use to calculate total cost based on number of dozens and number of extras? I'm asking, like, if I write an equals here, total cost equals something. Assuming that later I'll figure out how I get these 2 things, or assuming that I had them already, how would I calculate the total cost based on that? $8.50 times what? It's $1 for an extra. So the cost of a dozen times the number of dozens plus $1. So that's how we can calculate that. Perfect. Now, once we have the number of dozens and number of extras, that is the correct thing to calculate the total cost. How do we calculate the number of dozens and number of extras becomes the question. What do I do? Assuming I had number of bagels defined somehow, How do I calculate the number of dozens that I need? We just divide by 12. So we say num bagels divided by 12. Number of extras is going to be the remainder. So how do I get the remainder? So num bagels mod 12. Easy. Now I know if I have the number of bagels, I can calculate the number of dozens, number of extras, and from that I can calculate the total cost. So let me write these system.out.printlines here, which is going to be num. And then I'll have another one. So there might be syntax error in here, but let's just take num bagels equals 15 like I have in my input in the example and run that and see if that works. 1 dozen, 3 individuals, so I get 1150. Then I could change this to 28. Run that, see how that works. 2 dozen, 4 individuals, I get 21. Okay, so now I know that my formulas all line up. It's just a matter of using scanner at this point. So I'm going to take this one where I just have a hard-coded number and I'm going to modify it to use user input. So I'll create a scanner and then I'll print out the prompt. And then instead of equals 28, I say keyboard.nextInt to read an integer from the user. Now if I run this and I type in 28, I get that 2 dozen, 4 individuals. And if I type in 15, I get that 1 dozen, 3 individuals. If I hit that submit button, I can run through all these steps and I can see that I'm getting the right answer. Again, backend's a little slow today, but it works. So you take your problem, you break it down into steps. I also had requests to just kind of show how to do the extra credit for this one. Smarter Bagel Shop. For Smarter Bagel Shop, the question is, at what point does it make sense to just buy another dozen? Because if I'm buying 11 extra bagels, that's going to cost me $11, but it's $8.50 for a dozen, so it's cheaper to buy 2 dozen than it is to buy 23, 1 dozen plus 11. So I'm going to paste my code from the other one, get started here. What I have to do is figure out where that line is. At what point does it make sense? So I can start running my code, and I'll put in at 24 for the number of bagels. 24, so 2 dozen, that's $17. So I just need to keep lowering the number of bagels I want until I go under 17. Say I run it with 22 bagels. That's $18.50. So I should round up at 22 if I'm too short of a dozen. If I buy 20 bagels, $16.50. So that's less than 17. Let's run it with 21 now. Okay, so we see 9 individuals is the cutoff. If I'm buying 9 individuals or more, I should just round up to the next dozen. So my condition here is just if my num extras is greater than 8. If that's the case, I print out that thing I was supposed to print out, rounding up to save money, and then I just adjust my variables. So I'm going to say num dozens plus equals 1 because I'm rounding up, and then I set my num extras to 0. So now if I ask for 23 bagels, it's going to say I'm rounding up, it's going to print 2 dozen. Everything after the if stays the same. We don't have to repeat this. I have seen a tendency in students to see an if and then think that everything in the rest of their program after that if needs to be in the if and in the else. So they'll have like if the number of extras is greater than 8, and then they'll copy everything and they'll put it in there, and then they'll have an else case and they'll copy everything and put it there. But the if can just be a thing where you adjust for something and leave everything alone. So here I'm changing the number of dozens and extras, but everything down here where I calculate and print it out, I don't need to change that. That can stay exactly as it is. So you do want to minimize the amount of code you have to put in an if-else, especially if you're repeating it. If you can avoid repeating yourself, it makes code a lot easier to write. It also helps to make these intermediate variables, because if you just had num dozens instead of num dozens, if I wrote num bagels over 12 here, and then I wrote num bagels over 12 here, that's repetitive. It would be harder to write something like this. I wouldn't just be able to say that. I've seen a lot of kids get 2.5 by like tripling the size of their program. I had mentioned there's a way to do party pizzas without even using an if. Party pizzas is the one I'm going to tell you how many friends are coming. You need to buy enough pizzas so that everyone gets at least 1 slice. So the way to do that with an if is you divide by 8 and then you mod by 8. And when you mod by 8, you have a 0, that means that your number is divisible by 8. If you mod by 8 and you get not 0, that means it's not a multiple of 8, you need to add 1. So if I have 15 friends, I still need 2 pizzas. If I divide by 8, I get 1, but if I mod by 8, I get 7, so I know I need an extra pizza. But the key here is to realize that you kind of map these things based on ranges. If I have 0 friends, I need 0 pizza. If I have 1, 2, all the way up to 8 friends, I need 1 pizza. If I have 9, all the way up to 16 friends, I need 2. So I already know that some number divided by 8 is going to give me the resulting number of pizzas I want. The question is, can I do some math trick here that maps the set over here something else that I can then divide by 8 and get the right answer? So something I can do to the numbers 1 through 8 and divide by 8 and still get 1. The answer is to just add 7 to it. If I do any of these numbers plus 7 divided by 8, I'm still going to get 1. It's not going to quite be 2. 8 plus 7 is 15 divided by 2, still 1. 1 plus 7 is 8 divided by 2, 1. So 1 hits that minimum and 8 hits that maximum. So the code for that would be, I get num friends. And the formula for the number of pizzas is going to be the number of friends plus 7 divided by 8. Hence the number of friends, 10. You need 2 pizzas. Hit that submit button. Do things work as I expect them to? Another key point here is if I do 0 plus 7 divided by 8, that's still 0. But it is a tricky one. The if-else way to do it is to say the number of pizzas equals the number of friends divided by 8. And then if the number of friends mod 8 is not equal to 0, meaning it's not a multiple of 8, so it's not 8, it's not 16, it's not 24, etc., then you just add 1 to the number of pizzas.